Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Markets obviously like what they heard out of Geneva and the White House today, as the U.S. has confirmed that progress was made in talks with China and Switzerland over the weekend. In fact, tariffs going much lower than perhaps initially anticipated. Remember, at the end of last week, President Trump was talking about an 80% tariff on China seeming right, Mike, and instead what we get is the U.S. taking from 145% all the way down to 30%, and China goes from 125 to 10.
And that's with the prospect of going even lower if the fentanyl tariffs are removed or reduced, if there's some sort of sign of progress there with China. So there was a lot left open there, and they even left open the prospect of extending this 90-day pause. Yeah. We can't quite call it a deal, but it certainly is, as you put it, a truce or a moment of détente in this confrontation over trade with the world's second largest economy.
Yeah, and of course, President Trump took his moment to tout this truce, if that's what we want to go with here. He spoke from the White House earlier today.
In addition, yesterday we achieved a total reset with China after productive talks in Geneva. Both sides now agreed to reduce the tariffs imposed after April 2nd to 10% for 90 days as negotiators continue on the larger structural issues. The relationship is very, very good. I'll speak to President Xi maybe at the end of the week. We have some other things we're doing.
A total reset is how the president describes this. So let's get more from the White House, where we find Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall on this Monday. But Tyler, to Mike's point, this isn't yet a deal. We're still going to be negotiating in this 90-day window. So this reset is not yet final.
Right, exactly, Kaylee. While it is a de-escalation to give the sides time to negotiate, at the end of the day, we're going to have to see how long that lasts and if both sides can agree on a finalized trade deal. Because once Wednesday rolls around, that 90-day pause goes into effect, and then from there, the countdown clock really is on. Now, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked earlier today, what would it take to keep tensions low after that 90 days. He said ultimately it would be good dialogue in good faith, but did confirm to Bloomberg Television that at this point it is implausible that tariffs would drop below that floor of 10%. Importantly, both sides here are really trying to highlight that they have created what they have called a mechanism to keep talks going. And as you're about to hear, the Treasury Secretary told Bloomberg TV that this is going to be important for negotiations going forward.
China was the only country who escalated their tariffs in response to our reciprocal tariff level. So that resulted in an unfortunate escalation. So we now have a mechanism to deal with that. Neither side wants a generalized decoupling. The U.S. is going to do a strategic decoupling.
That reminds us that there's still a lot of negotiations to have and some big differences on the table. A few different threads that we're watching here, Kaylee and Mike, one including purchase agreements going forward. Both the Treasury Secretary and the President today said that the Phase 1 China deal could be used as a template. So we're going to be watching when it comes to U.S. ag imports into China, if that could make its way into any sort of purchase agreements and what sort of enforcement mechanisms would look like. The second, of course, is fentanyl. As Mike had mentioned, that 20% of that 30% tariff is tied directly to the United States fentanyl concerns. President Trump said that he believes China will act in good faith on curbing fentanyl flows and the ingredients used to make the drugs into the United States amid allegations that they are contributing to the drug trafficking. And then, of course, lastly are those non-tariff barriers that we're watching very closely. China did confirm earlier today that they're going to remove non-tariff countermeasures. We have taken that to mean that they are expected to suspend or lift some of those heightened export controls on critical minerals that came since April 2nd. We're going to have to see how these negotiations shake out. President Trump did say earlier today he could hold a call with Chinese President Xi Jinping as soon as this week.
All right. Wonder where that's going to fit in the schedule, as he has a busy few days in the Middle East ahead of him. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, thank you so much. And we want to take a look through the economic lens of what difference these tariff changes really will make between the U.S. and China, and turn to Anna Wong. She's our chief U.S. economist at Bloomberg Economics and is here with Mike and I in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Anna, obviously 30% is a whole lot lower than 145%. But I know you've been watching cargo volumes. We've seen this massive trade drop off between the U.S. and China already. How much is going to be revived by still an incredibly high 30% tariff rate.
Yes, Kelly, actually we put out a note last Friday that showed that in fact container ships leaving China has increased in the first week of May, and we connected the dots. We think that several of the U.S. retailers, after meeting with President Trump in late April, have resumed their order, and the ships carrying those orders potentially have already been setting sail to the U.S., arriving today, starting today, with many of those ships arriving on the 20th. And this was why we had thought that, in fact, they need to cut the tariff this week because those ships carrying Walmart and Target goods are arriving. So if you believe that that was the concerns about empty shelves was what motivated this cut, it also means that as this 90-day comes to an end, basically by mid-August, which covers the peak shipping period ahead of holiday seasons, the stakes for escalating actually would reduce because, the holiday season is assured. There won't be empty shelves. And so Trump could easily re-escalate again. And I just think that what we saw this weekend is not consistent with Trump's negotiation style, which is not a straight line down with the tariff rate. It usually comprises of escalation and then some de-escalation and then escalation back again until a final deal is reached.
So to what extent does this reflect a recognition on both sides, not just here in Washington, but also in Beijing, that the economic risk of carrying out this tit-for-tat economic trade war to the level it had reached was just so dangerous to the economies of both countries?
And that hits the nail on the head. Exactly. And the reason why I think the U.S. and China negotiations came out and say that they found agreement very quickly is that the agreement is that they do not want the worst case scenario, which is for trade to enter the embargo state at the peak shipping season. Most of the shipping in the holiday season, which accounts for over 40% of sales revenues for any U.S. firms, happen from now to end of August. So this is a critical period that I think U.S. and China both easily found agreement on to not disrupt. But beyond that, who knows?
Well, obviously, none of us can predict the future, including Federal Reserve policymakers, hence why they keep emphasizing patience. We have seen today in the aftermath of this truce being reached, Anna, the expectations for Fed rate cuts being taken down this year. Now, I think just 55 basis points are priced in. Does this make a material difference in the amount of easing you expect us to see?
Yes. So, I mean, our base case has been for only 25 bips of rate cut this year. So we were already lower than the rest of the market. But right now, what you could immediately see is that the May's jobs report and June's jobs report would not be as bad as in the situation where container volume continued to drop. Because we're now already seeing this week container volume is rising in the port of LA, and with a lot more firms planning to front run in this 90-day reprieve period, it means that the logistics sector just would not shed as much job as we thought. So there you have May and June's payroll being not as possibly not negative as what it could have been had, the plunge in the container ships continue.
Anna, there is a lot for the two sides to get through over the next several weeks. Is 90 days going to be enough to lock this in, given how detailed that fine print is going to be?
Not at all. Not at all, exactly. That's why I thought the 90-day reprieve is more of a holiday. Let's get through this holiday season first. Let's make sure that not a lot of small business are going bankrupt in the U.S. and China factories are not all going out of business. Because the U.S. and China's tariff problem, trade barriers problem goes really deep. And it takes years. Even in the phase one deal, it took a whole year. And during that year, President Trump was kind of fluctuating whether he should take it or not.
Well, to the point you were making earlier, these things tend to be a roller coaster with this particular president. Anna Wong of Bloomberg Economics, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we have to keep in mind that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has said previously a full deal with China could take 2 to 3 years. So we have to keep that in mind. So we want to get more on that now and turn to Sam Sachs, professor of China Studies at Yale University, who is joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Professor Sachs, welcome to Balance of Power. When we consider how different a place we are in now compared to before these talks beginning in Geneva over the weekend, from 145% and 125% respectively down to 30 and 10%. Yes, both sides took tariffs down by an equal amount, but do you actually really see this as a truce that is equal, or did China actually kind of come out the winner here?
It's too soon to know. Both sides have essentially agreed that talking is happening, and they couldn't even get that basic point straight between the two of them. We were engaged in this long game of chicken where Trump was insisting that she wanted a deal, and she didn't want to look weak, potentially facing a President Zelensky moment in the White House. So the fact that they have agreed to announce that talks are beginning itself is a stabilizing factor, but it tells us nothing about what the nature of any agreement actually will look like.
Professor Sachs, what is the significance of the two sides actually putting together a joint statement? There is a lot of optics in every trade negotiation, of course, but with China, the optics count even more. What do you make of this after just 2 days of discussions between the two sides?
Both sides want a deal. That's the bottom line. And I think it's coming from a place of political and economic weakness in both countries. What the joint statement says so far doesn't actually tell us anything. By and large, the statements are identical in Chinese and English, with the exception of some word choicing. I think whether or not they can get to a joint public agreement, once we get into the really hard issues, like what would a purchase agreement look like? What does fentanyl cooperation entail? The Chinese side desperately wants the U.S. to lift export controls. I don't see that happening. The U.S. side desperately wants the Chinese to undertake deep reforms in its economy. I don't see that happening. So once we get to the harder part of the negotiation, I think having this kind of joint communique is going to be increasingly difficult and could actually stall out altogether, depending on what happens.
Well, as you talk, Professor, about what the U.S. wants to see in terms of changes really to the structure of the Chinese economy, and this isn't unique to the Trump administration. The Biden administration under Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen talked about this plenty as well, concern over China's manufacturing overcapacity and the idea that it's flooding the market globally with cheap goods. What incentive does China have to actually change that practice? Can the U.S. really force that?
The incentive is going to have to come from internal sources. And something that often happens is you'll have interlocutors in China will use outside pressure from the U.S. to force changes to the domestic economy that politically wouldn't be possible without an external, U.S. forcing event, but it needs to come from the inside. So one thing we know about the lead of the Chinese delegation right now, the Vice Premier He, he's less of a reformer than the interlocutor for the first round of talks, Liu He. And so this is someone who's a staunch advocate of a state-led economy, not of more market liberalizations. And so I think that's going to be another factor that's going to make these kind of deep reforms more challenging. But we have to remember, Xi Jinping is under tremendous pressure right now in terms of Chinese jobs, Chinese businesses in the private sector. And so this is going to be something that's going to get them to the negotiating table, not necessarily because the U.S. is compelling them to. It has to come from within.
Professor Sachs, one thing that came up this morning during our conversation with Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, was a new baseline, perhaps, for tariffs. And we'll have a listen to this, and I'd like to follow up with a question about it afterward. Let's bring him in.
Are you saying that tariff rates will only go up from here if this really is a floor of 10% on the Chinese side and 30% on the U.S. side?
I'm not saying that they're going to go up, but it would be implausible that they would go below 10.
Professor Sachs, how does this reset the U.S.-China trade relationship when it comes to tariffs, if we're talking now about a baseline that could perhaps go a little bit higher?
We don't really know yet. I think they're just trying to send a signal to consumers, to voters, to U.S. stock markets on the Trump administration side. Today, the stock market rally was a huge political win, and Trump wants to take credit for that. So I think that's what this baseline signaling is really about. But until we get into the nitty gritty, it's unclear. Now, could China just go back to the 10% baseline and be treated the same essentially as the other countries that are all in the process of potentially looking for deals or not? It's possible. But I think the idea is it's going to be impossible to fully recover to before Liberation Day. We're not going to go back to that. And it's a question of how far we're going to go. Is this just going to be strategic sectors, or is this going to be a sort of wholesale trade embargo? And I think we're looking now at a more narrow tailored decoupling. But what that means, again, what is the U.S. side actually going to offer up here is really what we have to watch.
Professor Sachs, what sort of signal is this sending to other U.S. trading partners that are also locked in their own negotiations with the Trump administration, even as we speak?
I think that, no one wants to have I think no one wants to be like China in this situation. So maybe it opens the door to more deal making. If China was the most intractable, I think we could potentially see a flood of other deals, maybe looking like the US, UK, or Mexico. But China certainly has always been the elephant in the room and will set the tenor for others to come.
Well, but when we consider trading partners in Asia specifically, which the administration has put a lot of emphasis and prioritization on, India, Japan, South Korea, how does that also influence ultimately how reliant the U.S. actually will be on China for trade and for goods going forward?
This gets at the question, what does the Trump administration actually want? Do they want to close the loopholes, for example, that have just squeezed trade and exports to places like India, Vietnam, Mexico? Because what happened is you have manufacturing diversification. No longer can export from China. Let's shift those supply chains to Vietnam, Indonesia, India. But then all of a sudden, those tariffs were just as high. So if the goal here is to reshore U.S. manufacturing and restore America's place in those supply chains, I think we're going to still see significant pressure on some of those other parts of the world. But at the same time, the U.S. is not going to want to alienate its key trading partners at a moment when it wants to sort of bandwagon. It wants Southeast Asian countries, for example, to come on board and be an economic counterweight to China.
All right. Professor Sam Sachs of Yale University, where she is a professor of China studies. Thank you so much for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And it was interesting, Mike, to hear the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in his interview on Bloomberg Surveillance earlier, characterizing what the U.S. is trying to do here as being a strategic decoupling from China. The prior administration didn't want to use the decoupling language at all, but I guess this one is looking at it in a targeted way.
But in a few areas. And they talked about pharmaceuticals, and they also talked about semiconductors. And that, of course, is an area of key contention. And Professor Sachs even brought that up in passing. And it is crucial to note the differences between the two sides, including with export controls over sales of U.S. ships to China.
Yep, those non-tariff barriers we keep hearing about, or non-tariff mechanisms, or what have you, export controls theoretically fall into that. So we'll continue to follow this story here on Balance of Power. But up next, we have to turn to other geopolitics as well, as President Trump makes tracks to the Middle East and potentially has a visit to Turkey. That could happen. We'll have the details next here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I am Kaylee Lyons alongside Mike Shepard here in Washington, where, of course, we've been following a number of stories that broke over the weekend, but perhaps none sent the city quite as abuzz as the reporting from ABC that hit yesterday, that the government and royal family of Qatar, where President Trump is visiting on his trip to the Middle East this weekend, was preparing to offer him, for free, a luxury Boeing 747 jumbo jet for him to effectively use as the new Air Force One. This is something the president himself has confirmed and talked about from the White House earlier today.
I think it's a great gesture from Qatar. I appreciate it very much. I would never be one to turn down that kind of an offer. I think it was a gesture because of the fact that we have helped and continue to. We will continue to. All of those countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar and others. We keep them safe. If it wasn't for us, they probably wouldn't exist right now. And I think this was just a gesture of good faith.
And Mike, we should note that the president says this is not a gift to him personally. It's a gift specifically to the U.S. Defense Department. But when we're talking about the size of this gift, this is an airplane that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. There are massive legal and ethical questions around this.
And strategic questions, too. What would the government of Qatar want in return, or perhaps expect in return? Not even so much as a quid pro quo per se, but if they are offering something, eventually they might want something in return. And the question remains, what is it? Is it perhaps an easing of restrictions on access to NVIDIA chips? Is it something else? Is it just a better understanding with the U.S.? And the president sought to make clear that he would not be using this luxury jumbo jet after he left office, as ABC had reported. But nonetheless, it did raise the question about whether this was some sort of emolument, which is prohibited above a very nominal level to him.
So we want to get into this now because it's a fascinating story, and there's other topics to discuss around it too, and turn to our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us. Rick, of course, Stone Court Capital partner and Republican strategist. Jeannie, Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Jeannie, I was struck by the reaction of Laura Loomer, who, of course, is somewhat of a diehard for the president. In fact, in her critique of this gifted airplane, she mentioned that she would take a bullet for President Trump, to use her words, but even she doesn't like the notion of this very expensive gift from a foreign government. And I wonder if you think that backlash may be enough to make this not happen.
It absolutely could be. It's Laura Loomer, very close to the president. It is Ari Fleischer. He's on Fox News all the time. There are other conservative Republicans who have come out and said, no, Mr. President, do not do this. And of course, while you and Mike were talking about this, I'm thinking, what happened to Made in America? We can't have dolls and pencils made overseas, but he can have a plane. I mean, putting aside the real serious consequential security issues, the constitutional issues, the legal questions, what about Made in America, Mr. President? I guess that's gone by the wayside when it comes to his jumbo jet.
Well, Rick, is there anybody in the president's inner circle who might be in a position to actually talk him out of this? He really made it seem like a done deal, and it would be pretty hard to turn it down on his way to Qatar to meet with the leaders there.
Yeah, let me think. Susie Wiles talking him out of a $400 million gift. No, don't think so. Look, it is a Boeing jet. It was made in America. I mean, we got a piece of that, although maybe designed and outfitted in Qatar. This is going to be a story that lasts a while, because even though very generous gift by Qatar, I mean, very inappropriate for the president to say yes, he can't fly on that thing until it's outfitted with all the most state-of-the-art electronics, redundancy in every facet of it, and significant alterations to its ability to defend against an attack. These are all the reasons why the current new Air Force One is slow to get going, because there are a lot of changes. All that's got to be done to this plane before he flies in it for 1 hour. And that is a new charge to the American taxpayer. The reason it's going to the Department of Defense is because they have the budget to actually retrofit it. So, it's going to be a story we're going to be talking about all summer long, because someone's going to say, gee, how much did that cost the American taxpayer to retrofit, in addition to the new one that we're building before the end of the administration?
It's an excellent point, Rick, and obviously this story is going to be kept in the news, at least for this week, because President Trump is going to be spending time in Qatar this week, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. He is on board the current Air Force One heading to the Middle East right now. And Rick, I wonder what outcome you really expect from this first big trip abroad of his second administration, not focusing necessarily on geopolitical issues or regional conflict. Instead, we understand he's mostly there to try to secure money, investments into the United States. This just about deal making?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is. I was actually on the president's trip to Saudi Arabia in May of 2017, when he basically was trying to reopen Saudi Arabia for investment and foreign direct investment into the United States. And that worked for a little while, but the Biden administration kind of chilled that out. So I think this is to retro start that, right? Get it going again. Let's get those Saudi dollars, the UAE, Qatar dollars, get the GCC into investing in the United States. And I'm sure there'll be questions with these folks about price of oil, how much pumping's going on. Nothing is more obsessive to Donald Trump than the price of a gallon of gasoline. And these folks in the Middle East have a lot to do with that. So my guess is the one thing that's probably not going to be a news story, and it'd be interesting if it was, is whether or not he can convince the Saudis to enter into an Abraham Accord, and something he was very proud of in his first term with Israel. But it just seems Israel's not on this agenda this week.
Jeannie, how critical is it for the president to show continued progress when it comes to those investments? He started really on his first full day in office announcing that kind of an economic push from abroad into the U.S. You'll remember that big Softgate AI data center announcement, and from there it's been off to the races. How much more are we looking for, and how much more will he be able to follow through with all of it?
Yeah, I think the concern of many of us is the question of whether this is about investment in the United States or investment in Donald Trump, his companies, his sons, his family, Steve Witkoff's family. I mean, he is famously not going to Israel this trip. He is going to Qatar. He is going to Saudi Arabia. These are places where just in the last few weeks and months, his sons have talked about deals they have struck in the interest of the Trump family and the Trump business. They have talked about this Gulf agreement. They have talked about this crypto agreement that was made and that they have benefited from. So yes, I mean, if the focus is on investment in the US, that is absolutely something to be welcome. But I think the concern here, just like the concern about the airplane, is this really about the US and what's in the interest of US security? Or is it about Donald Trump and his family and friends? And you see real evidence, if you just look at where they've been traveling and what they've been posting, that a lot of the focus is on the latter, unfortunately.
Rick, I want to return to where you ended your last answer. As you mentioned, Israel perhaps not being as much in focus. And we should point out that today, back in Israeli territory, is the last living American Israeli hostage that was being held by Hamas, Adnan Alexander. This appears to be a release that was essentially negotiated singularly without necessarily Israel being involved. And whether you're looking at this particular instance, knowing there are still remaining hostages in Gaza, whether you look at the kind of truce that has been gotten to by the U.S. and the Houthis, the U.S. talking to Iran, all of it kind of paints a picture of President Trump being, if not at odds, at the very least, not as in alignment with the Netanyahu government as was thought when he came into office. Is he still the best friend Israel's ever had?
I think he's still probably the best friend Israel's ever had, but I'm just not sure Bibi Netanyahu is going to think of him as the best friend he's ever had. You've struck a good chord. Donald Trump's out doing his own deals with the Houthis and with the Hamas, and the reality is you never hear about that beautiful development in Gaza anymore. That was a real lift to Bibi Netanyahu's war plans to be able to clean that out and actually move Palestinians out of there. So much of that early, first month in office, when there seemed to be an incredible link between the two countries and the two presidents, has seemed to pretty much vanish. Now, there are other priorities, and it doesn't mean that the president has lost his affinity for the prime minister. But the reality of it is that this was a week where you would have thought the president would have ended his Middle East tour in Jerusalem, a big victory lap based on his relationship with the Israeli people and with Bibi Netanyahu, but didn't seem to come to pass.
Jeannie, without about a minute left, we also may see the president take a detour to Turkey for talks on Ukraine. How much pressure is he under to deliver and show some more progress there?
Yeah, he's under a lot of pressure, a lot of it self-imposed because we're long past his 24, 48-hour window, Mike, for him to get this deal done. But weirdly, over the weekend, he seems to be negotiating with Zelensky on his own. I mean, Putin seems to be out of it. He's saying to Zelensky, just make a deal, end the war yourself. Don't wait for Putin. So I think Zelensky has done the right thing, saying he's going to go to Istanbul, invited Putin to come. It doesn't look like Putin will come, and that will open him up to continue to get support militarily, intelligence, and otherwise from the U.S. as Putin continues to be the sort of problem in these negotiations, not Zelensky.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our political panel on this Monday. Thanks for being here, as always, on Balance of Power. And still ahead, we'll be joined by the former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, Patrick McHenry, as we turn our focus to Congress and the budget reconciliation package. What exactly is going to be in these tax cuts? We'll have the details ahead here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Kicking off the week in Washington, which is going to be a very big one for Republicans in the House of Representatives specifically, is tomorrow. About 24 hours from now, actually, two key markups are going to happen in crucial House committees. The Energy and Commerce Committee, which has released a bill that includes what the Congressional Budget Office says is more than $880 billion in cost savings, in part because nearly 14 million people could get kicked off Medicaid rolls in the next decade. Then there's the Ways and Means Committee, which, of course, is charged with outlining the broad tax package, all the tax cuts the president wants, and perhaps trying to find a number that is going to make the SALT caucus happy. According to our reporting here at Bloomberg today, the number they're looking at for married couples in high tax states like California and New York, $30,000. So you remove the marriage penalty, it's up from $10,000, but it still might not be enough, Mike Shepard, for some of those SALT caucus members who've been pushing for numbers more than double that.
Well, that's right. And Mike Johnson can't afford to lose too many votes, given the margin in the House right now. And everything is riding on this. The big, beautiful bill we've heard the president talk about so much. And there is a lot more than just SALT going into this. We're also looking at some of his campaign priorities, including exempting Social Security income and exempting tip income as well from taxes. So we're going to be looking for a lot, and lawmakers have a lot of angels to stand on the head of a pen here.
Yeah, they do, keeping in mind they want to do this in just a handful of legislative days, as the Speaker wants to see this thing passed on the floor by Memorial Day. So we want to get into this wider reconciliation process now and turn to someone who was in, of course, the House of Representatives until recently, former Republican congressman from North Carolina and former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, now Bloomberg contributor as well. Patrick McHenry is here with us in Washington. Welcome. So when we consider this SALT issue in particular, knowing that there are a number of moderate members who make or break the House majority, who are going to have a very difficult time with this, considering their constituencies, is this actually what is going to make or break an ultimate floor vote?
Absolutely. So the SALT caucus has been hard at work for years on this. The reason why we were able to pass the original Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 is because we overcame those votes, those Republicans from SALT states, New York being the biggest and the loudest group of Republican legislators here. SALT does not model out as a Senate problem at all. There are no Republican senators from states where the state and local tax is a big issue for ratepayers. New York holds the balance for Republicans, and they're the majority makers in the House of Representatives. They gave us the majority 3 years ago and last year. And so they need to be taken care of. They need to be taken care of in a way that's sufficient for their constituents. They can't go home and say, I raised your taxes. That's not a good message for Republicans anywhere, but most especially in a state like New York. So you have really competent, smart legislators here. The question of whether or not 30,000 is going to be sufficient for them, we're going to see, and we're going to see in a very public way. These are the most public Republicans you see in the House of Representatives. They are loud.
Mike
They
Lawler,
know how, Mike Lawler. They know how to get media attention. They know how to draw attention to the issues they care about and draw people in. So we're going to be drawn in, and we're going to be live with them every step of the way.
Based on your experience, what sounds like a level that would get these members over into the yes column.
So this is the difficulty of negotiating on this. More is the number, right? So you say a number and they say more, and eventually we'll find that number. I don't think it's going to be a round number. At the end of the day, it will be something different than what we tend to do in the Congress, which is like a nice round number. So we're gonna see this. I don't think this is a fully baked product coming out of the committee.
Well, and I guess the markup will be revealing. We've heard tell that it's going to go into way late in the night tomorrow, and something we'll have to continue to follow throughout the week. I also want to talk about what's going to get marked up in the Energy and Commerce Committee, though, because, of course, Medicaid was the other massive question. They have, according to the Congressional Budget Office, come up with a package here that is actually going to save more than they were charged with saving, more than the $880 billion. But the cost of doing so is potentially 13.7 million people losing their benefits over the next decade. Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican, says this argument is both morally wrong and politically suicidal. Do you see this as political suicide if it passes?
No, because savings to healthcare programs does not necessarily mean those that benefit from the healthcare program get less of it. It may mean that somebody in the middle has their wonderful profit box that gets gored. And so we see this with payment issues through CMS. This is a very standard challenge with healthcare policy, is that they always go back to a number of people that are directly benefited, and it never is the case. So let's step back. What is the package that House Republicans are proposing here? First, Brett Guthrie is the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. He is an expert in healthcare policy. He has worked with their members to dial in the specifics of the policy that they think will have the greatest savings to the taxpayer and the least amount of harm to those that benefit from these healthcare programs, number one. Number two, they're going to reform these programs so you have better delivery and better quality of those that are getting healthcare benefits through Medicaid. So I think some of these things are quite sensible, and I think the shock and awe number of people getting thrown off of the plan, I think it will not end up that way. I think it'll be a much set of sharper outcomes that will be beneficial to the taxpayer and to the public.
Are the work requirements that are being discussed right now even practical? Will people be able to follow through and follow all the steps necessary to continue qualifying if they are put in a position of having to make sure that they verify employment to receive Medicaid benefits?
Traditionally, yes. Those people that are receiving these benefits tend to be experts in how to receive these benefits. So let's step back. On work requirements, Republicans have been for work requirements for our social safety net for generations. This is not a new set of policies. And in fact, this work requirement we put in place for food stamps during the debt ceiling negotiations 2 years ago at this time. That got a 2/3 majority in the House, the Senate, and signed by Joe Biden. Some of these work requirements are not right-wing policy or some ideal set of right-wing policy. Some of them are just very practical things that can be achieved in a bipartisan vote.
Just because you mentioned the debt ceiling, we also should point out on Friday the Treasury Secretary sent a letter to the Speaker that says you need to get that thing raised before the August recess, because at that point is when the Treasury might no longer be able to meet its obligations. Does that time frame make you nervous if the debt ceiling raising mechanism is to be the reconciliation package?
It makes me nervous, but as a congressional leader, it is the welcome sign that there's an end date for the pain and suffering of going through the reconciliation process. We saw this with the Biden administration trying to do 2 reconciliation bills, and it drug on for months and months and months. We have an end date now. And if you want to leave town as a congressional Republican, you better get your stuff together in the month of July, or you're going to be sitting here roasting in the month of August. I think that it condenses the timeline. That is a good thing for the safety and health and happiness of the American people.
Chairman, does the need for speed, though, mean perhaps that the president may have to let go of 1 or 2 of the big priorities he outlined during the campaign? And we were just talking about this in the open, exempting Social Security income and tipped income. Does something have to give as the push and shove gets more intense?
I think what you see from this administration, I think what you see from this president, he's going to get his way with congressional Republicans. He didn't make 50 campaign pledges on tax policy. He made 2 or 3. He's going to get those 2 or 3.
Something else that he talked about a lot on the campaign trail was being a super pro-crypto president. He wants to make the U.S. the Bitcoin capital of the world. He seemed widely supportive of legislative efforts on the Hill, and yet we saw one of those efforts fail on the Senate floor last week as the stablecoin bill failed to get adequate support. Knowing you spent a lot of your time leading the Financial Services Committee on this issue, what does that signal to you, not just about the future of stablecoin legislation, but if you can't do that, what hope is there of getting something on market structure?
Oh, that's right. So this is the easier go of it. A stablecoin is a payment mechanism. We have a payments regulatory regime. We haven't defined what is a payment stablecoin in federal law yet. It is a very simple undertaking for a stablecoin bill. Market structure is a little more complex because we're talking about a new decentralized object and various pieces of technology that do different things, right? Yeah. So it's defining the internet. Well, the internet is many things and many layers to it. It's hard to do that in one bill. So market structure is the thing that is necessary for crypto to flourish here in the United States. The payment stablecoin bill that the Senate has worked on, they marked it up, welcome sign for the Senate Banking Committee. Commend Senator Scott for his adept handling of this, and Senator Haggerty and Lummis and Gillibrand. They did a fabulous job. But you have almost all Republicans together on crypto, and you have a remnant of Senate Democratic members. So you have 10 to 15 pro-crypto Democratic senators, and they're fighting against the base of their party, especially the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, who is a real problem to
Elizabeth
crypto.
Warren, yes.
Well, what they understand is that crypto is popular. They want to be for it. They also don't want to get bludgeoned by their fellow Democrats. It has been a very tough set of politics for these Senate Democrats to be pro-crypto. What we'll see, though, this week, maybe even next week, but probably this week, is they'll come to terms with a reasonable set of policies, and they'll have enough cover from their colleagues, Democratic colleagues, that they can do this. I think they need a little political cover, frankly, to come to a reasonable spot, and that's what we got last week.
Chairman, speaking of political cover on crypto, what are you expecting from the White House in its policy blueprint from David Sachs on cryptocurrencies and digital coin? Are you expecting this to really shape things on Capitol Hill?
I think these products are largely baked. We spent 4 years crafting the market structure bill we passed out of the House with a 2/3 majority. I think it's going to look a lot like that. The key attributes, though, for a market structure bill are the definition of decentralization. Is it narrowly controlled? If it's narrowly controlled, that's not decentralized. We have a regime for that in the United States. It's under securities law. Good luck, right? Go try it out at the SEC. You don't need a new regime for that. If you're truly decentralized and you don't have a narrow group controlling, you need to have your own regulatory regime. That's already baked in. That's understood from all branches. Everybody's engaged in this. The second piece of this is the classification based off of the technology. What does this token do? We should regulate it based off of its functionality and its purpose. And those two things are baked into all these bills, Democratic, Republican, over this Congress and the previous Congresses. So I think it's going to be baked in, and I think we'll get to a reasonable outcome, but with some drama to get a market structure bill, and that's going to take longer, perhaps July, maybe into the fall before that's resolved.
We only have a minute left, so this is going to be unfair, and I apologize in advance. But today we're seeing a massive market rally on the U.S. and China taking their tariff rates on each other lower after talks in Geneva over this past weekend. Was it the Trump administration that really is the one that blinked here?
It's unclear yet. And I think there's a rally in hope.
Yeah.
Hope is not reality, right? Hope is not, well, it is today, actually, but hope is not a set of policies, and it's not a tariff. We have to actually see the finer details of the outcome, and if this gets resolved soon in a permanent way, that is going to be long-term good for the United States and our trading partners, and the longer it takes, we're just extending pain.
All right, well, we have a 90-day window to start. We'll see where we are by August. Bloomberg contributor and former House Financial Services Chair Patrick McHenry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.